What makes childhood truly unforgettable? What little things from the past keep warmth and joy despite all the years that have passed? In every small object, in every sound and smell of those years, there is a whole story hidden. A story that can revive the brightest memories and bring back a sense of true wonder. Memories of childhood are not just pictures from the past. They are a whole palette of emotions, flavors, and sensations that still live inside us. Sometimes it's enough to hear the creaky sound of an old Slinky spring or smell a glue stick with vanilla to instantly plunge into those carefree days. Every object, every little thing was part of the big world in which we grew up, learned, and dreamed. Ready to take a trip through the highlights of childhood in the 70s? Together we'll remember what made those years special, from the brightly colored plastic rings from vending machines to the warm smell of school corridors. It will be an immersive experience that will never lose its magic. Then go ahead. Let's discover together those little treasures that make the past alive and dear. Children's plastic lunch cases with images of superheroes or cartoon characters in them. They were square, with a rigid body and a distinctive latch that had to be pushed hard to open. A suitcase depicting Spider-Man or the Flintstones was a source of pride. The plastic would get minor scratches over time, especially in the corners. The stickers were starting to peel off, but no one was in a hurry to take them off. Even faded, they were an important part of the image. Inside was a thermos with a screw cap that could be used as a cup. The metal inner flask of the thermos tinkled when tapped. The smell inside the suitcase was special, a mixture of peanut butter, boiled egg, and thermos plastic. Sometimes an apple would be put in for lunch, which would then soak everything in its aroma. The sandwiches were wrapped in wax paper or thin polyethylene. On the bus on the way to school, everyone would put their suitcases on their laps, like a display case. The handle was plastic, with grooves for the fingers, but often rubbed the skin. The suitcases were also used to store stickers or little things at home. They clicked when closed, and it was a recognizable sound. Some models had the owner's name written in marker on the side. Even when the food inside got cold, the suitcase itself seemed warm and alive. It was a constant companion of my school years. On field trip days, they put a paper napkin inside. Sometimes there were notes from parents inside. The suitcase was easily wiped with a sponge, but grease stains remained forever. It lasted for years, until the lid cracked or the latch broke. Suitcases became a symbol of a child's personal space. Many didn't part with them until high school. They brought children together. Discussing the characters on the lid was the beginning of friendship. Even now you can find them in vintage stores, and the smell from inside comes back instantly. Automatic pencils with transparent bodies and replaceable leads. The pencils were light, almost weightless, with a body made of transparent colored plastic. Inside were small lead sections, each like a separate cartridge. When one ran out, it had to be taken out and inserted from behind to advance the next one. This action was admired by others. Some models were two-colored or had glitter in the case. The pencil clicked quietly with each press. The leads were fragile and broke easily, especially if pressed hard. Sometimes children would pick up 2 or 3 pencils to sand the lead between them. The mechanism seemed like something from the future. The pencils were not sharpened, which made them convenient. The case was often decorated with stickers or scratches from frequent use. They were in a pencil case next to the usual wooden pencils, but they always stood out. The plastic smell of the new pencils was particularly pleasant. They wrote thinly, sometimes too faintly. Some school children specifically asked their parents for them. There were whole sets of lead pencils in plastic boxes on sale. The color of the case could be matched to your mood. Teachers did not always approve of them. The pencils broke during tests. But for children, it was a way to show their taste and individuality. Pencils were often lost. They were forgotten on the desk or borrowed forever. Even when broken, they were kept in a drawer like a jewel. These pencils were more than a tool. They were a technological marvel in an age of simplicity. Shaped soap bubbles in bottles with thread and a mini brush. The bottles were small, multicolored, with a plastic lid with a stick with a ring hidden inside. The solution smelled like soap, a little sweet and cloying. Bubbles were blown a lot, especially if it was warm. In the summer, they bought them for change in the shops around the house. The brush was rough, but it worked. Sometimes the solution spilled out, staining fingers and clothes. The bubbles glistened green, blue and pink in the sun. They lived for only a few seconds, but everyone ran after them as if they were treasure. If you squeezed a bubble with your hand, it left a film on your skin. Some children tried to make giant bubbles by stretching the ring. The solution was often supplemented with water to make it last longer. Sometimes the wand was lost and they tried to blow just through the tube. There were bottles in the shape of animals, fruit, or cartoon characters. Bubbles were played at home, outside, and even in the bathtub. Walls and windows were covered with drops, and parents grumbled. But the sound of a bubble bursting was almost musical. In school bags, such bubbles were hidden like a secret. They created a sense of celebration on an ordinary day. Sometimes a solution got in your eyes and it stung. There were competitions. Who would blow the biggest or the longest-lived bubble? The bubbles didn't fly in the rain, but they tried anyway. Those bubbles were a small joy that fit in the palm of your hand. The foam on the lid dried up and was scraped off with a fingernail. Slinky springs that ran up and down the stairs. Slinkies were made of cold metal, heavy and pleasantly jingling. They were sold in boxes with brightly colored lettering, often on display next to Rubik's Cubes. The first move on the steps seemed like a miracle, as if the toy had come to life. Sometimes the movement was perfect, and the spring would go on its own, step by step. But more often it ended in a tangle of metal. It was painful to untangle, but it was impossible to give up the toy. The spring lay pleasantly in the palm of my hand and stretched the full length of my arms. The sound of its vibrations resembled bells. There were also plastic versions, colored but less durable. Slinkies slid off couches, chairs, bookshelves. They were played like a catapult, launching small toys. Sometimes it was carried in a briefcase to show at recess. The spring clung to hair and sleeves. It could pinch the skin on a hard hit, but no one complained. Slinkies were a symbol of physics in action, of movement and balance. You could swing them for hours just by holding the ends. When the spring hit the tile floor, it tinkled like a musical instrument. There were attempts to launch it with two people holding the two ends. Some kids would come up with tricks, how to make the Slinky flip over on the stairs. Even when the spring no longer moved, it was kept as an heirloom. Slinkies combined simple mechanics with the absolute magic of movement. A poster with the multiplication table hanging in every elementary school classroom. It occupied a prominent place, most often above the blackboard or on a side wall. The brightly colored cells with numbers from 1 to 12 attracted the eye. The corners of the poster were slightly bent, and especially towards the end of the year. The surface glistened from the sunlight streaming through the blinds. The numbers sometimes seemed huge, sometimes daunting. Some students knew it almost by heart. During tests, their gaze would involuntarily slip in its direction. Sometimes there were pictures on the poster. Apples, trains, chickens, to make the numbers seem clearer. It was part of every school morning. Teachers would pick up the pointer and highlight a line to memorize. The paper was thick but faded over time. Occasionally someone would poke it with a pencil, leaving tiny dents. The multiplication table helped even those who were bad at math. It was associated with childhood, with colored notebooks and a box of crayons. Some teachers made homemade versions, with a bright frame made of colored paper. When a new poster was hung, it was considered an event. Sometimes the table was drawn on the blackboard with chalk. It served as a backdrop for almost all school photos in the classroom. Even in the summer when the class was sorted out, it was hung last. It was like an anchor, a reminder of structure and order. Without it, the classroom seemed empty. The multiplication table wasn't just a chart, it was part of the school rhythm. It taught routine, patience, and precision. It was not just her, but everything around her. The desks, the creaking of the floors, the breathing of the classroom. Velvet vinyl covers for school diaries and notebooks. They were sold in newsstands and stationery stores, wrapped in cellophane, with the distinctive smell of new plastic. The surface was soft, velvety, but not of cloth, but of a special vinyl that resembled velour. Green, burgundy, and blue were the most common colors, but sometimes there were purple or brown. Such covers attracted dust easily and had to be brushed off with the palm of a hand or a sleeve. When it was put on the diary, it shrank a little, as if a garment had been pulled on. Sometimes the folds didn't match, and the cover would tug at the edges. Some kids put scrapbooks, stickers, or postcards under it to decorate it. The covers were often decorated with lettering with gel pens or glitter balls. The back sometimes had pen marks from writing without taking the notebook out. The corners quickly became faded, erased, and dull. In winter, they became electrified, especially if you carried the notebooks in a plastic bag. Sometimes the cover began to smell like rubber, especially in the heat, but it still seemed beautiful and important. It had a sense of order. The diary looked dressed up. Girls were especially proud of velvet covers and matched them with pencil cases and rulers. There were embossed covers, flowers, birds, abstract curls. In high school, they cooled down, but in junior high school, it was almost a status. Some families kept such covers for a long time, and they were used for several years. Sometimes they wrote names or drew hearts on the inside. If it was lost, they started to panic. Without it, the diary seemed naked. There were also simple plastic ones, but vinyl ones stood out for their softness and warmth. They gave school things a home-like coziness. Even shabby, such a cover was a thing with a story. Many people still remember the feel of their fingers on its fleecy surface. A glue stick with a vanilla or almond scent. It looked like a small deodorant, a plastic body, a cap on top, and a spinning wheel on the bottom. When the rod was unscrewed, it gave in gently, like butter. The smell was strong, sweet, like the aroma of baked goods or cream. Some children opened the glue just for the smell. They used it in labor lessons when making cards and appliques. The layers were uneven, somewhere thick, somewhere almost transparent. If too much glue was applied, the paper bubbled. Often the glue rolled into lint, and I had to smooth it out with my finger. My fingers smelled like almonds afterward, even after washing them. Inside, the glue was light-colored, white, beige, or with a slight pink tint. Some packages had pictures, especially imported ones, with bears, butterflies, stars. When it ran out, kids would twist the stem all the way out until it fell out. Sometimes the cap was lost and the glue dried up forever. In the closed pencil case, the scent of glue mixed with the smell of slate, wood, and paper. Teachers allowed them to use it on tests, only if they didn't get distracted. Some kids tried to fix dried glue with water, and it soaked to a mushy mess. The glue left greasy stains on notebooks, which did not disappear afterwards. There were also colorless versions, but the scented one was especially beloved. It was considered more grown up than the glue in jars with a brush. Sometimes glues were exchanged like treasures. There were mishaps. The glue broke inside and had to be removed with scissors. Even when dried, it was kept in a pencil case out of respect for the smell and memories. Its sweet aroma was part of the school atmosphere, like a background of smells from childhood. Puffy winter jackets with plastic closures and synthetic insulation. They were voluminous, swishy, and colorful. Yellow, red, blue. The material glistened in the sun, especially fresh in winter. Inside, there was a dense layer of synthepon, which quickly clumped together. The jackets were fastened with a zipper and large plastic buttons, often tight. The hood was on an elastic band or buttons, and sometimes with a lining of fleece or fake fur. When walking, the jacket made a noise like a wrapper. It hardly bent at all, and children looked like balloons in it. The pockets held mittens, wrappers, and keys on a string. The hem was often wet with snow, especially after snowball fights. Sleeves with inner elastic bands collected snow, which then melted and ran down the skin. During winter recess, jackets were dumped in a pile in the corner of the classroom, and they steamed from the heat. The smell of a wet jacket was special, a mixture of synthetics, snow, and body. After school, they would be hung on the radiator and they would dry out, leaving a puddle. Sometimes the jacket would get tattered if there were many layers of clothing underneath. Zippers often broke and then fastened with buttons. There were models with colored inserts, patches, emblems of sports brands. The hood was sometimes tied with a cord, which was always lost. The lining in some places came out, especially at the collar. In severe frost, the jacket was blistering, and it was difficult to move in it. But it was warm, even if everything around was freezing. Over the years, it became heavier. From patches, stains, and traces of time, it was worn through the spring until it started to drip. The jacket was not only a garment, but a safety zone. It warmed not only the body, but also the memory of carefree winters. Cardboard ice cream cartons that had to be torn open at the side to get the briquette out. They were sold in small grocery stores or stalls labeled ice cream in blue letters. The packaging was thick, sometimes with drawings of cows or Christmas trees. To get to the ice cream, you had to tear off the edge on the side, and often it was done with your teeth. Inside hid a briquette, rectangular, hard, with slightly melted edges. If the ice cream was chocolate-coated, it cracked and crumbled. The sticky chocolate stayed on your fingers and was licked off. Sometimes the briquette was cut with a knife at home and eaten on a plate, but more often it was just held in the hand, wrapped in scraps of cardboard. In the summer heat, it melted faster than it was eaten. The wrapping became soft and stuck to the fingers. Afterward, hands got sticky and were wiped on a t-shirt. The wrapper was thrown into the nearest trash can, which was always full. The ice cream often smelled like vanilla and a slight flavor of cardboard. There were flavors with nuts, cream, strawberries. Sometimes there was ice inside and you had to chew. Some brands had thick chocolate, others were just glossy. Sometimes there were surprises, a chipped corner or a chipped edge. But still, we ate with pleasure. This ice cream was associated with summer, vacations in the street. It was inexpensive, but tasty. If my parents bought two, it felt like a holiday. The packages were similar to each other, but each had a different color scheme. My fingers got cold, especially if it was windy, but that didn't bother, because that briquette was part of a happy childhood. Pocket mirrors with a lid that held a mini comb inside. They were sold in the girls' goods departments and looked like toys. Round, oval, or they opened with a slight click, sometimes with effort. Inside was a cloudy mirror, often with fingerprints. Next to it was a mini comb, pull-out or retractable, with short tines. She didn't comb particularly well, but no one expected that. The important thing was style. The girls pulled out the mirror at recess, fixing their hair or fixing their hairpins. The mirror was mostly plastic, slightly distorting the face. The plastic case scratched over time, especially if worn next to keys. Sometimes the cover fell off, but the mirror continued to be used. There were models with princesses, flowers, cartoon animals. Some people kept in the mirror not only a comb, but also stickers or small notes. It smelled like plastic and mom's makeup bag. The insides often fell out if the lid was opened abruptly. The mirror was sometimes lent to a friend. It was a show of trust. There were whole sets of such mirrors on sale, by color, shape, pattern. It could be held in one palm, like a secret. The teeth of the comb would eventually bend or break. Some people hid tiny photographs in the mirror. It was kept in a bag, a backpack, a briefcase, as a personal ritual. Even if the mirror wasn't used, it was just nice to have. It gave a sense of self-importance, neatness. Such an object made everyday life a little more beautiful and quiet. Brightly colored plastic rings and clips from vending machines for 25 cents. They were pulled from yellow capsules that fell out of humming vending machines after turning a shiny knob. The machines stood at the supermarket exit or next to the drugstore, and children always begged their parents for a coin, even if they knew the toy would be fragile. The capsule would open with a distinctive click, and a ring or clip would glisten inside, a symbol of brief but vivid delight. The rings were often shaped like stars, butterflies, or hearts, with tiny gems made of colored plastic. Clips seemed like adult jewelry, despite a plastic base that broke quickly. The metallized coatings wore off quickly, especially if you wore the ring every day. Sometimes the jewelry glowed in the dark or shimmered in the sun. It was especially nice to find a rare color, like green with spangles or deep purple. Such finds were discussed at recess at school or in line at the cafeteria. Rings were lost in the grass, under desks, in the pockets of winter jackets. But even if a piece of jewelry broke, the capsule was kept. Secrets, wrappers, or gum could be hidden in it. Often jewelry was put in shoe boxes or cookie tins. Some jewelry was passed down to younger brothers or sisters. Capsules were sometimes reused by filling them with their own treasures. Rings became part of games. They became magical artifacts or rewards for fictional feats. Despite their fragility, they were associated with celebration, with sunshine, with chewing gum and brief happy moments. Every visit to the store was accompanied by the hope of a new capsule. Sometimes a child was allowed to spin the machine himself, and it felt like a real ritual. The yellow plastic hemispheres rolling down the metal slide were a small spectacle. Even adults sometimes looked at the machine with curiosity, remembering their childhood. The jewelry collections were constantly being updated. Something was lost. Something came in to replace it. They cost almost nothing, but they meant a lot. Brightly colored plastic rings and clips from vending machines for 25 cents became a symbol of affordable childhood joy. Multicolored gel pens that sometimes smelled like fruit. These pens appeared in pencil cases when the usual blue paste was getting boring. Multicolored gel pens, which sometimes smelled like fruit, were something of a fashion accessory. They were sold by the piece or in sets in plastic cases with transparent lids. The smell of each, strawberries, grapes, lemons, promised that writing with them would be not just comfortable, but fun. The ink was thick and flowed easily, but not always evenly. Some colors, like yellow or orange, were hard to read on white paper, especially in low light. The pages were scribbled with poems, titles, and captions to drawings. The back of the notebook was often soaked with ink, but no one was embarrassed by it. Pencil inscriptions were outlined in crimson or turquoise ink. Purple pens were considered adult pens for writing important notes or addresses. Pens broke, caps cracked, paste leaked out, the feed mechanism jammed. But they continued to be carried around, even if they were no longer writing. Exchanging pens was almost like exchanging stamps, a matter of pride. Some people tried to extend the life of a pen by inserting paste from another pen. The caps were lost instantly, and the pens started to stain everything around them. But when the ink started to run out, everyone was sad to see the color fade away. There were pens with glitter. They scratched the paper, but had a magical effect. Each gel pen had its own character, and you could feel it even in the smallest things. Notebooks with their notes were like a kaleidoscope, each page in a new style. Girls often wrote in questionnaires or diaries with them. Some pens were kept simply because they were beautiful. They were associated with carefree evenings, school friendships, and secret messages. Colorful gel pens, which sometimes smelled of fruit, became an element of school aesthetics, not just a writing instrument. Old mailboxes with a slot and flag on a street corner. The old slotted and flagged mailboxes on the street corner were part of a landscape that was hardly noticed, but had always existed. They stood on a metal leg or wooden support, often askew, with peeling paint. A flag on the side would go up when someone left a letter, a gesture that was an understandable signal to the letter carrier. In winter, the box was covered in frost, and in summer, it was hot beyond belief. Sometimes the paint on the lid peeled so badly that the metal peeked through. Inside were catalogs, postcards, bills, letters with stamps and neatly written addresses. The letters fell inside with a soft but distinctive click. The sound was the end of an important process. The box might be labeled with a name, address, or no junk mail. Children would tiptoe up to the box to reach the lid, especially if the box was taller. In the rain, it would get covered with drops, leaving rusty stains on the wooden support. Sometimes people looked in just out of curiosity, hoping to find something interesting. There were times when the box became a repository for notes between neighbors. It was knocked to see if there was anything inside. Birds would sometimes land on top and leave their tracks. Some families decorated the box by painting flowers on it or screwing figurines on it. The box's decrepitude was seen as part of the coziness. It was familiar, almost like an old door. The letter carrier opened it with a single movement, as if he knew its character. Sometimes the lock jammed and he had to pull the lid several times. In summer, the box was warm and the paper sagged a little from the heat. Sometimes a cobweb or a dried leaf was found inside. Even so, every day someone approached it with hope. The old mailboxes with the slot and flag on the street corner were not just a delivery point, but an element of everyday quiet and order. Pieces of foil from chocolate candies from which figures were formed. Pieces of foil from chocolate candies from which figures were made were lying in pockets, on desks, in drawers of desks. After the sweet was left a thin metal shell which tinkled and sparkled in the light. It was rolled into balls, pulled into flagella, folded into little people or abstract figures. Sometimes the foil with inscriptions and logos was kept whole, with neatly straightened corners. Some people managed to make real collections. Foil from candy bars, candies, chewing gums. Rare colors, gold, purple, green, were especially valuable. Some children glued such pieces into diaries or on the covers of notebooks. There were cases when foil was used as a coin in games. It was even rolled into miniature crowns for dolls. Foil memorized the shape. Whatever was wrapped in it remained as an imprint. Sometimes they tried to wrap back an uneaten piece of chocolate, but then they regretted it. It melted. Thin foil would tear if you bent it carelessly, but that was the beauty of it. They made stars, rings, bracelets. Some people managed to curl long snakes, which they used to decorate pencils. There were moments of silence when hands mechanically folded something from a shiny scrap, just not to be bored. The rustling of the foil was recognizable and made me want to eat something sweet. Sometimes the foil was crumpled into a lump to launch as a projectile. It was thrown into an urn with a distinctive metallic sound. Some foil figures survived for months, lying in drawers like little talismans. Candy foil was associated with children's ingenuity and the desire to give meaning to even the most fleeting thing. Pieces of foil from chocolate candies, which were used to make figures, were an easy way to make something beautiful out of nothing. Gum-flavored erasers in the shape of fruit or animals. Fruit or gum-flavored animal erasers were the little treasures of the school pencil case. They looked like strawberries, pineapples, bears, kittens, or cartoon character faces. Bright, soft to the touch, with a surprisingly pleasant odor. They seemed almost edible. Some of them were composite. Caps were removed, legs or ears were separated. Erasers were often not used for their intended purpose. It was too pathetic to spoil such beauty. They were carefully taken out during breaks, shown to friends, compared by shape and smell. Sometimes there were exchanges, especially if someone had a rare fruit or animal. Some children gathered whole collections and kept them in small boxes like jewelry. Over time, the flavor would wear off, but the memories of it would remain. Some had a favorite, like grape or orange, and carried it with them everywhere. Sometimes the smell was so intense that the eraser scented the whole pencil case. When writing they did not erase well, they smeared the pencil or tore the paper. But it didn't matter because they weren't for practice. They were for fun. When an eraser was used, they tried to erase with the edge to preserve the figure. Some got lost, rolled under desks, or ended up in other people's satchels. There were those who tried to bite the eraser because of the smell, once and for life. Sometimes the figures were used as mini toys. They were played on the windowsill or used to build houses out of notebooks. The appearance of a new eraser caused envious glances. They were given to each other on birthdays or as a prize for a good grade. The colors were bright, unnatural, but that was their appeal. Gum-flavored erasers in the shape of fruit or animals were more than a school accessory. They were a way to make everyday life a little more magical. Plastic straws with a bend that were put in boxed juices and milk. The bendy plastic straws that were put in juice and milk cartons were an essential part of lunch. They were glued to the side of the box on a thin, transparent film that had to be carefully removed. Little hands couldn't always manage it, and the straw would come off with the glue, so you had to drink straight from the box. The bend itself was the main trick. It had to be carefully unbent so as not to break. Some straws broke right off, and then you had to drink crooked or at an angle. They were ribbed on the inside and made a distinctive crunching sound when chewed. Some children were constantly chewing on the straws, bending them, making figures out of them, or even launching them like a rocket. The straws were short, and they did not always reach the bottom of the box. They had to be tilted. They were transparent, blue, pink, yellow, simple but pleasing to the eye. Sometimes, because of poor gluing, the straws simply failed to pierce the hole and the juice began to leak out. But it was all part of the ritual. Box, straw, one sip after another. Strawberry-flavored juice or milk had a special flavor just through the straw. When there were 2 straws in a package, it was real luck. Kids would share them with friends or stash them in their pocket for later. Some even collected straws by color as a collection. There were times when a straw was tried to be washed and used again, especially if it was a rare color. Sometimes straws were used as tubes for blowing bubbles. If there was a glass of water and some soap nearby. In the heat, they got hot and lost their shape, but they were still a favorite lunch item. Crumpled, bent, chewed, they lay all over the school cafeteria. The plastic straws with a bend that were put into boxed juices and milk were simple but important details in a child's life. Miniature books with stickers that had to be assembled by numbers. Miniature books with stickers to be assembled by numbers were sold in kiosks next to chewing gum and comic books. The cover was bright, glossy, with pictures of cartoon characters, athletes, dinosaurs, or animals with big eyes. Inside were pages with gray silhouettes, each with a number where you had to put the corresponding sticker. Sometimes the numbers were in order, sometimes chaotically, to make the task more difficult. Envelopes with stickers were sold separately, and each contained random images. Waiting for the next package to open was almost like a lottery. Repeaters caused mild disappointment, but were used for exchanges. Children carried the re-stickers in their pockets, or used rubber bands to staple them into packs. Some glued them to their briefcase, pencil case, or school desk. If there was a rare sticker, there was no limit to the joy. Sometimes it glowed, had glitter, or was a little bigger in size. You had to glue it very carefully, trying not to skew it. Sometimes the page missed, and the sticker went past the outline. Then it was torn off and tried again, already with the corners torn off. The completed books were shown to friends, kept in desk drawers or under a pillow. When a book was fully assembled, it was proud of it as an accomplishment. There were topics on which several series were published at once, and each new issue became an event. Sometimes parents helped to find missing numbers at markets or from acquaintances. A book filled to the end felt like a small victory. Independent, painstaking, real. Some stickers were glossy, others matte, and my fingers glided over them in different ways. Sometimes the stickers came with captions or little comic strips, which made collecting more interesting. Miniature books with stickers to be assembled by numbers were more than a toy. They taught patience, kept track of time, and gave quiet pleasure. Chewing gums with puzzle liners or cards. Chewing gums with puzzle liners or cards were in round plastic boxes in the checkout area of every store. They were inexpensive, but seemed especially valuable. The wrapper is brightly colored, sometimes with comic strips right on it. Inside is a hard, almost rock-hard pad of gum. The first chews were a real challenge. The teeth would tire until the mass became elastic. The flavor was intense, fruity, minty, or quite chemical, but powerful. It didn't last long. After a couple of minutes, only the smell remained. But the main thing is the insert. It could be a rebus, a joke, a mini comic, or a superhero picture. Some were part of a collection, like a series of cars, monsters, athletes. They were kept in boxes, books, pockets. Some taped them to notebooks or the wall next to the bed. Sometimes there were exchanges or even games where the cards were bets. In some series there were rare or bonus inserts, with glitter, foil, or a changing image. There were identical ones, and then they were shared or exchanged for missing ones. There were those who collected gum of a certain brand just for the liners. Sometimes there was a task on the liner. Color, find differences, draw. Chewing gum was meaningless without it. In wet weather, the liners would spoil, and that was more frustrating than the missing flavor. At home, the liners were stacks of them, tied together with string. They smelled of paper, sweetness, and a little bit of time. Chewing gum with puzzle liners or cards was more than just a treat. It was part of conversation, sharing, and just a fun ritual. Cards of famous baseball players collected, swapped, and discussed. Cards of famous baseball players collected, swapped, and discussed were kept in old shoeboxes, plastic albums, or just under a rubber band in a briefcase. On the front is a brightly colored photo of a player in motion or in a characteristic pose. On the back, dry statistics, height, weight, team, average for the season, sometimes an anecdote or favorite food of the athlete. These cards were not just collected, they were studied like sacred texts. Some had a whole system. They separated pitchers from catchers, collected series of certain years, or just their favorite team. Some cards were especially rare, with a gold frame, special gloss, or even a facsimile of an autograph. If such a card was found, it was put in a transparent file and shown only to the chosen few. Cards were exchanged in the yard, behind the school building, or at the bus stop. Sometimes they argued heatedly about how much a card was worth. There were also fakes, printed on a home printer, with faded colors that everyone quickly recognized. Cards were discussed in the evenings, checking the TV broadcasts and news about the league. Sometimes there were battles, throwing the cards on the ground, whose card would fly farther or fall upwards, the one who won. Some cards were so worn that the numbers could not be read. The most valuable thing was to find the card of a rookie who later became a star. There were issues devoted to finals, records, famous moments. They were especially appreciated. Sometimes parents brought cards from the flea market or from distant trips. It was a real luck. The cards smelled of time, cardboard, printing ink, sometimes the dust of the closet. They were poured over in the evenings, arranged by color, team, year. The cards of famous baseball players, collected, swapped, and discussed, were more than just a hobby. They formed memories, friendships, and a small personal mythology. Bicycle spoke decals that made a clicking sound when riding. Bicycle spoke decals that made a clicking sound when riding were simple, but sounded like a whole orchestra to a child's imagination. Most often they were ordinary plastic bottle caps, pierced with a nail and put on the spokes. There were also special purchase signs, colored, round, or with emblems. When they moved, they made a crackling, clicking sound that echoed throughout the neighborhood. A bicycle with such a thing could be heard long before it appeared from around the corner. The sound was mechanical, insistent, and as if it were alive. The faster one rode, the louder and more frequent the clicking. It was almost like the soundtrack of childhood, especially on summer evenings. Some people would put multiple covers on to make the sound layered. Sometimes the plaques would break, fall out, and then a roadside search would be organized. There were homemade versions made of cardboard or plastic cards. They would get soaked quickly, but were pleasing to the eye. A bicycle with such clickers seemed more powerful, like a motorcycle. In the company of children, they compared the sound, who had louder, cleaner, more rhythmic. Sometimes the clicking noise disturbed the adults, and they asked them to remove it, but this was rare. In school parking lots, you could tell who had arrived by the sound. Some people carved signs in the shape of stars, hearts, arrows. There were stickers and symbols that were glued directly onto the spokes, along with snaps. Sometimes they added flags on the antenna or glowing reflectors. Clicking became part of the game, a signal to start a race or just a marker of presence. Sometimes it was annoying, but something was lost in the silence without it. The bicycle spoke decals that made a clicking sound as they rode were more than just a noisy toy. They created a sense of movement, freedom, and a summer that never ended. These little things are like living pieces of the past that take you back to moments when the world seemed simpler and brighter. They store smells, sounds, and feelings that cannot be forgotten, even after decades. Each of these objects contains a small but very meaningful story of childhood. A story of games, friendship, first discoveries, and quiet joys. These are the memories of a time when every new morning brought something special, and every little thing seemed important and magical. Immersing yourself in these details, you return to that unique feeling of coziness and warmth that only true nostalgia gives. There is no place for the hustle and bustle of the modern world. Only sincere emotions and vivid pictures from the past. If this view of childhood resonates with you, if you want to remember with me more amazing little things that made life in the 70s unique, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Here you will find not only nostalgic stories, but also the real atmosphere of bygone times, filled with bright memories and warmth. Subscription is an opportunity not to lose touch with those moments that made us who we are. Let us together cherish and preserve these precious moments, share them and revitalize the past so that it continues to live in our hearts.